So first of all, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. It's quite a pleasure. I've been enjoying these talks for years, so I'm excited to contribute to this growing conversation about how to build developing minds. So I'm going to present a radical empiricist view of the origins of knowledge. And I've always loved the nativist empiricist debate. It's the reason that I chose the graduate school that I did back in 2003. It's the reason that I set up a controlled rearing lab in 2008 when I started my own lab as an assistant professor. And I've certainly bounced back and forth between nativist and empiricism across my career. It really wasn't until a few years ago when artificial intelligence started producing generic learning systems like transformers that I became more convinced about this radical empiricist position. So jumping in, our research focuses on two interrelated questions. So first, what are the origins of knowledge? When a newborn first opens her eyes, what kinds of machinery does she use to learn to perceive and understand the world? How does a newborn learn to perceive objects and space and number and develop social skills? The second question is, how do we build machines with animal-like intelligence? If we have a complete answer to the first question, then we should be able to reverse engineer the brain's learning machinery and build machines that learn like newborn animals. And ultimately, we want to be able to understand the learning mechanisms in brains with sufficient precision to be able to build a single system that develops all of the core mental skills that we see in humans and animals. Currently, however, there is no agreement on the type of algorithm we would need to develop animal-like mental skills. So you can think about theories of the origins of knowledge as occupying this one-dimensional space determined by the number and domain specificity of innate ideas. So we have radical nativism on the right, with lots of innate ideas and predetermined mental structures, and we have radical empiricism on the left with few, if any, structures. So to orient everyone, here are some positions in the history of Western philosophy. So going from nativism to empiricism, we have Plato, Descartes, and Leibniz. We have Kant, we have Hume, and we have Locke. And here are some positions in contemporary cognitive science. Again, going from nativism to empiricism, we have Fodor, we have Chomsky, we have the Bayesian tradition, we have core knowledge, we have Watson, and we have Skinner. Now, regardless of whether you agree with the particular placement of individuals or research traditions in this space, this chart really does illustrate that there are deep disagreements on the origins of knowledge. Despite being a very long debate, there's still no agreement on fundamental issues. Researchers disagree on when mental skills develop. They disagree on how mental skills develop. They disagree on why mental skills develop. And they disagree on the nature and the type of machinery that produces mental skills in the first place. So to provide a glimpse into the nativist strategy and some of the phenomenon supporting this position, let's first focus on this nativism side of the spectrum. And the strategy of nativism is essentially to isolate the core primitives of the mind, right? What are the building blocks or the first movers of perception and cognition? And one powerful way to do this is through controlled rearing. By raising animals in strictly controlled environments from birth, researchers can determine what skills and behaviors are present soon after birth and what role experience plays in the development of those mental skills. So here is one example from our lab exploring the origins of viewpoint invariant object recognition. So during the rearing phase, we raised newborn chicks in a virtual world that contained a single object rotating around just a 60-degree viewpoint range. So this was the entirety of their visual experience with objects. They never saw this object or any other object from any other viewpoints. So essentially, we controlled all of the visual object experiences or training data in machine learning terms that were available to newborn chicks from the onset of vision. We then tested whether they could recognize that object from novel viewpoints. So on the right, we have the imprinted object that's shown from a novel viewpoint. And on the left, we have an unfamiliar object, which is actually more similar to the imprinting stimulus from a pixel level perspective than the new viewpoint of the imprinted object. So this task requires building high-level or viewpoint invariant object representations. And to measure the chicks, we have a camera positioned in the top of the chamber, and we essentially measure 24/7 where the chick moves in the chamber and whether they choose object A over object B. And we found that chicks can readily solve this problem. They can build abstract viewpoint invariant object representations that generalize across novel viewpoints. And in fact, we found that newborn chicks rapidly develop a range of core visual skills. So here's a bunch of findings from our lab, all of which were obtained using fully automated high-precision controlled rearing methods. So first, as I just showed you, chicks can solve viewpoint invariant problems. So if we imprint chicks to any particular one of these views, they can then recognize the object across all of the novel views, despite never having seen the objects from those views. Newborn chicks can solve the visual binding problem. So if we imprint chicks to an object defined by a purple circle and a yellow triangle, and then we give them an option between that and a yellow circle and a purple triangle, they'll distinguish between the two, despite having the same colors and the same shapes, just in a swapped configuration. Newborn chicks can solve the object parsing problem. So if we raise chicks in a virtual world that contains one object moving on one background, right? So 100% correlation rate between the object and the background, newborn chicks can nevertheless recognize that object across novel backgrounds. So they have this capacity to parse or segment objects, even if it's the very first object they've ever seen, and even if they don't have experience seeing that object across multiple backgrounds. We found that newborn chicks have exquisite motion perception. So in this study, we imprinted chicks to a point light display of a walking hen, and then we tested whether they could distinguish that stimulus from point light displays of, for example, a walking cat or random motion in a wide variety of controls. And newborn chicks, again, showed exquisite ability to be able to recognize exactly this particular motion pattern, even though it's just a bunch of black dots dancing around a screen. We found that newborn chicks have object permanence. So if you raise chicks in a world with an object that's never occluded, and then that object moves behind a barrier, the chicks will go behind that barrier where the object disappeared, and they'll wait behind that barrier for about 1 or 2 minutes, almost as if they recognize that that's where the object disappeared. And finally, we found that newborn chicks have viewpoint invariant face recognition. So again, we can raise chicks in a world with no objects, just a single face. And in particular, we imprinted them to that middle face in the orange border. And when we then present them with the faces from a wide variety of other viewpoints, they can immediately recognize that face, and they reunite with that face as their imprinted object. So newborn chicks can do a lot from a little, right? They develop all of these skills when reared in environments containing a single object. So these findings suggest that maybe brains have hard-coded domain-specific knowledge, right? We see object skills developing rapidly in the absence of extensive experience with objects. So it might be tempting to conclude that these mental skills are hardwired into the brain through evolution. But another possibility is that maybe these core mental skills are learned. These experiences available in the chamber, right, however sparse and impoverished they may be, might provide sufficient training data for learning these core visual skills. And specifically, core skills could be learned from early visual experience within natural world. And 2 defining features of natural worlds is that they're slow and they're smooth. So in this 2-dimensional experience space that I'm showing you, we have speed as one axis, and then we have smoothness as the other axis. And if we were to position natural visual environments within this space, they would all occupy that bottom left corner of the space. right? Natural visual worlds are slow and smooth. So we tested whether the development of object perception requires experience with a natural world. So some chicks were raised with an object that moved slowly and smoothly over time. So again, this provides the kind of slow and smooth spatial temporal experiences that chicks normally experience in the world. Other chicks were raised in a world with an object that continuously rotated quickly. So 24/7, this object performed one rotation every second. This is much faster than the typical space-time object experiences that animals experience early in life. And then another group of chicks was raised with an object that moved non-smoothly. So this object, in a sense, teleported from frame to frame over time. So it doesn't have that smooth, continuous motion that we typically associate with normal natural object motion. And what we found is that the development of core object perception requires experience with a natural visual world. In particular, the development of object parsing, object recognition, object permanence, and face recognition all required experience of objects moving slowly and smoothly over time. So this suggests that core visual skills are not predetermined, right? They develop when brains learn or adapt to natural visual experiences. But of course, these results still leave many unresolved questions about the origins of knowledge, right? So what machinery produces these core mental skills? And what role does experience play in their development? Right, on one hand, these skills or these experiences might be necessary to produce these capacities in the first place, but another possibility is maybe these abilities are innate and experience simply maintains those abilities over development. So to answer these questions, our lab has started exploring models on the other end of the nativist empiricist divide. We're exploring models that have no innate knowledge about the world. The models start with no knowledge about objects or space or number or the social world. Rather, these models grow in a sense. They develop and they evolve and they adapt to experience. And specifically, we've been using runnable models from artificial intelligence. So we focus on generic fitting models like transformers because they're domain general, giving us runnable empiricist models for testing learning claims. So these models are image computable, meaning that the models learn from raw sensory inputs, just like young babies and newborn animals. These models learn to solve real-world tasks, like recognizing objects across complex and cluttered backgrounds. So these models allow us to test what kind of generic fitting system learn when reared in a newborn's world, right? If we gave a transformer the same experiences as a newborn animal, do they develop the same kinds of things? And so what I like about this is that it allows us to go beyond our intuitions, right? We no longer need to rely on our intuitions about what is learnable and what is not. We can directly test what does a generic domain general system learn when given the same experiences as a newborn animal. And specifically, we've been exploring whether evolution and development follow common general fitting principles. So as probably all of you know, Darwin famously theorized that we can understand the origins and diversity of animal species in terms of general fitting principles. Right, so neurogenesis provides a suite of variation, or the gene pool provides a suite of variation, and then natural selection selects for genes that produce more fit animals, including animals like ants and humans and bacteria and the family dog. So likewise, we think that development can be understood through the same lens as evolution. So neurogenesis provides a suite of variation, and then modification of synaptic weights provides connections that produce more fit connections. And this fitting process, we hypothesize, may give rise to diverse mental skills, like motor development and intuitive physics and social skills and navigation and so on. And so to highlight these commonalities with evolution, we call this a mini evolution view of the origins of knowledge. And the core idea is that knowledge starts from scratch and then gradually develops as brains fit to prenatal and postnatal environments. So in other words, core skills are products of generic fitting emerging in an individual's lifetime. So to sketch out how this might work in practice, again, we hypothesize that at conception, all knowledge and mental skills develop from generic, domain general fitting machinery. So we might say that knowledge starts as a blank slate, and we tend to call this a space-time fitter to emphasize that we think the system is fitting to the high-dimensional space-time data distributions available in the natural world. Then, during prenatal development, prenatal brains learn from spontaneous activity in the retina, in the cochlea, in the body, in the cortex, and so on. Right? So one example are retinal waves, which are available prenatally. These are waves of activity that move across the eyeball over time as an animal is developing. And critically, since this activity occurs on sensors, prenatal data has some domain-specific content, which means that at birth, animals should have some domain-specific mental skills. Right? In other words, core or innate mental skills are products of generic fitting machinery adapting to the domain-specific data available prenatally. And then, of course, during postnatal learning, animals continue to learn about the world, developing domain-specific knowledge, fine-tuning existing knowledge, and creating new knowledge. Now, I want to emphasize that we are not at all the first to think about development through an evolutionary lens. These ideas have a very long history. But given its long history, why haven't fitting theories become widely accepted the way that they are in biology? Now, one possibility is that it might simply be wrong. But another possibility is that maybe there have been roadblocks methodologically and conceptually on showing that fitting is a viable alternative or hypothesis for learning how to understand the world. And we favor that second account. In particular, we think there have been three major roadblocks preventing the field for testing whether fitting is a viable model or view for learning how to understand the world. The first roadblock is newborns are incredibly hard to study. So we need precise methods for studying newborns, but the problem is that most newborn methods are low-powered and they produce noisy measurements, which means that we'll have imprecise benchmarks for trying to reverse engineer the origins of knowledge. I think this is a serious problem. So the challenge becomes, how do we collect precise benchmarks from newborn subjects? The second roadblock is we lack control over the environment of newborn animals. But to test fitting theories, we need to systematically manipulate the rearing environment. Right? Fitting is inherently a theory that the brain fits to the space-time data distributions in the environment. So we need to be able to control the environment, meaning the challenge becomes, how do we control and manipulate a newborn's environment 24/7? And the third challenge is we lack scalable fitting models. Right? Testing fitting theories requires raising fitting models and animals in the same environments. So we can test, does a fitting model show the same behaviors when it fits to the same kind of world as a newborn animal? So the challenge is how do we rear and test animals and fitting models in the same environments? So we've developed a solution to all three of these roadblocks, and I want to present it to you as a three-step process. So the first step was to pick a model system. And perhaps needless to say, humans won't suffice, right? Humans can't be raised in controlled environments from birth. And ultimately, we need a model system that we can raise in strictly controlled environments to test fitting theories. So newborn chicks are an optimal and ideal model system for studying these questions. So first of all, we can raise newborn chicks in controlled environments from birth. We can hatch them in complete darkness, move them over to a controlled rearing chamber, turn on the chamber lights, and completely control everything that they see and ultimately everything that they hear. And I want to really emphasize that we take great pains to control all their visual experiences. So this is me many years ago with night vision goggles. When we're moving the chicks from the incubator to the virtual reality chambers, we put on night vision goggles so they're not going to be exposed to any extraneous visual experiences. And when we do all animal husbandry, we again carefully control. We put on night vision goggles, turn off all the lights so they don't see anything we don't want them to see. Second, newborn chicks and a mammalian brain share similar canonical cortical circuits. So with both birds and mammals, we see this hierarchy of information processing with a nearly identical pattern of input and output neurons. Both birds and mammals end up processing information with the same kind of individual cortical circuit. And if we scale out to the level of the brain and look at the hubs in the brain, we also see the same kinds of hubs that we see in mammalian brains. Right? We see visual areas and auditory areas and hippocampal areas and associative areas and so on. So studies of chicks can reveal general insights into how animals with brains similar to human brains and mammalian brains end up learning about the world. And finally, chicks do a lot of the same kind of stuff that we do. They develop common core mental skills and behaviors. There's evidence that chicks have object recognition and selective attention. They develop a sense of number. They develop intuitive physics and social skills. They learn to navigate the world very quickly. They have auditory cognition. They explore the world and so on. So with chicks, we can at least make a first run at these questions about where these kinds of core mental skills come from. So the second step of this research program was to develop high-powered methods for studying newborn animals. And to do this, we developed fully automated controlled rearing methods. Again, our method involves incubating eggs in complete darkness, and then moving the chicks to VR chambers, again in complete darkness, and then turning on the chambers to reveal a new virtual world to the subjects. And I'm showing you here two different chambers that we've built. So on the left, I'm showing you a 2-screen chamber, which is what we've used for most of our work, especially back at USC, my prior institution. And then on the right, I'm showing you our new 4-screen chambers. These are controlled by a video game engine. So we have, again, a camera up the top that continuously records where the chick is moving. And then as you can see in the little inset, it updates the projections on all 4 walls. So it always looks like a realistic 3-dimensional world. So the nice thing about both of these methods is that they're fully automated, meaning that we can measure chicks' behavior 24/7 for weeks or months at a time. And these methods, as I'll show you on the next slide, are high-powered, and they produce no experiment or bias because, of course, computers do all the work for us. We can also raise animals in interactive worlds. Right? So because this is a video game engine, we can trigger events when chicks do certain kinds of things. And essentially anything that we can program into a video game engine, we can raise a chick, and as I'll show you shortly, a machine in that same kind of world. We could control all their visual experiences from the onset of vision, allowing us to do apples-to-apples comparisons between animals and machines. And as I showed you in the very first experiments, we can also push vision beyond its natural bounds. Right? With virtual reality, we can raise animals with unnatural objects, like those non-smooth objects that I showed you previously, and really rigorously look at the role of experience in the development of core mental skills. And finally, I want to mention that chicks are completely convinced by these virtual objects. So they spend most of their time with the virtual objects, the same amount of time they spend with real objects. So from all we can tell, they are convinced that these are realistic social partners, so to speak. Now, I want to emphasize the value, again, of precise benchmarks for trying to reverse engineer the brain, and automation can be invaluable for this. So this is the amount of data collected per subject in many classic controlled rearing experiments with chicks going back 3 or 4 decades. Typically, you collect just 6 minutes of data per chick. Whereas this is the amount of data that we collect with automation. It's a 1,000-fold increase in terms of the amount of data per subject. And this really matters. So here is a visualization of the data distributions from non-automated versus automated methods. With the non-automated methods, the signal's not particularly clear, right? 40% of the data actually goes in the opposite direction of the effect. That's the blue shaded region on that curve. This is a really hard signal to follow for engineers trying to reverse engineer the brain. But with automated methods, the signal is very clear, right? We know exactly what the chick did. And to provide a better sense of why automation helps, we systematically increase the amount of data in the analysis for 2 of our studies, going from just 12 minutes of data per subject, all the way up to 3,360 minutes of data per subject, which was the full 24/7 observation. And we can see the effect size going from a very small effect size all the way up to these massive effect sizes of Cohen's d's of 1 and 2, and oftentimes they get much larger than that. So this provides a very clear signal, again, for comparing animals to models. And in fact, our studies typically reach 5 sigma levels of statistical significance, which is the threshold required for new discoveries in theoretical physics. So we've taken a domain that typically yields very small effect sizes and noisy measurements, right? The domain of studying newborn animals, and design methods for producing massive effect sizes and precise measurements. So the final step of this research program is what we call digital twin studies. So essentially, we build digital twins or virtual replicas of the controlled rearing chambers in a video game engine. So here's a video showing you what these digital twins look like. We make these digital twins as photorealistic as possible so that we can make sure that animals and machines can be trained with the same data and tested with the same tasks. And we then insert fitting models into virtual chick avatars and raise those virtual agents in those digital twin environments. And we use generic space-time fitting models, which fit to the spatial temporal data distributions in the avatar's visual experience. And we use transformer models because they start from scratch and they learn through fitting, right? So from a fitting perspective, an untrained transformer has a huge repertoire of variation in all of its connection weights. And then for selection, we use unsupervised temporal learning. And in particular, we use contrastive learning through time, which was developed by Yoshin Trietsch's group. This algorithm essentially pushes together the embeddings from images that occur closely together in time, and it pushes away embeddings from images that occur in distant points in time. And this temporal selection process essentially mimics the unsupervised temporal learning that occurs in brains. There's a wide variety of evidence that adult brains and newborn brains rely on temporal information in order to build up representations of the world. And then finally, we just test what mental skills emerged from fitting. So putting this all together, we essentially run parallel controlled rearing experiments on newborn animals and machines. So we raise newborn animals in a particularly designed controlled rearing world. We then raise fitting machines in exactly the same world so that both the fitting machines and the newborn animals are trained on the same data and tested on the same tasks. So we call these newborn embodied Turing tests because, again, we're making apples to apples comparisons between the learning abilities of a newborn animal and a model. Now, before moving on, I want to emphasize that newborn embodied Turing tests give us a new way to compare brains and machines. So the standard approach is to take a human adult who has had a lifetime of experience and then take a model that has been trained on a completely different data set, right? Something like ImageNet, and then to compare them. Now, the problem with this approach is we can't tell whether differences between the biological and artificial system are due to the learning algorithm or the training data, because the biological and artificial systems were trained on different data. Digital twin studies provide a solution to this problem. So we raise biological systems in one environment. We raise artificial systems in the same environment as the biological systems, right? So they get the same training data across development, and then we compare them. And better yet, we can actually compare their development over time. So how does the newborn animal develop over time? How does the model develop over time? And then we can ask, do animals and models traverse common developmental paths when raised in the same worlds, including, of course, both prenatal and postnatal worlds? Okay, so now I want to ask empirically whether generic fitting models can explain a host of core mental skills. And I want to take you through a subset of mental skills that we've studied using the methods I just showed you. And I want to start simple with edge representations, and then we'll gradually increase the complexity as we move down that table. So edge representations are a classic example of an innate visual feature, right? Ever since Hubble and Wiesel's seminal work, edge representations have been postulated to be innate features of the visual system. But what machinery actually produces these edge representations? Could a generic fitter learn edge representations from the kind of experiences available to a developing fetus? So to test this question, we simulated retinal waves in utero and then trained transformers on those retinal waves. So we're going to select a transformer as our model. And then we're first going to look at the untrained performance of that model. So the task that we used was an orientation selectivity task. So we have 10 different orientations going from 0 degrees to 90 degrees, and we have 10 degree increments between different positions. So we have 10 different categories, so to speak. Chance performance is 10%. And you can see that the transformer scores exactly at chance levels. There are no edge representations in an untrained transformer. And below the graph, I'm showing you a t-SNE visualization. So this is a way of visualizing high-dimensional representations in low-dimensional spaces. And what we can see is that images coming from the same orientation are hopelessly jumbled with one another, right? We don't see nice clustered representations for the same orientations. It's kind of, again, a hopeless jumble of representations. We're then going to train the model on retinal waves. So we simulated retinal waves. Again, these are kind of bounded, cohesive patterns that move across the eyeball continuously across development. They're a lot like objects in that they maintain a spatial temporal continuous motion across space and time. So we generated 80,000 of these images, and then we trained our transformer, again, in a purely unsupervised way, on those retinal waves. And then we tested the performance again on the line orientation task. And what we found is that the transformer goes from chance performance to basically perfect performance. A huge learning gain simply from learning from retinal waves. And if we look at the t-SNE, we now see these beautifully clustered representations where images coming from the same orientation are nicely clustered in the embedding space. So this suggests that edge representations, at least, can start from scratch. Remember, the untrained performance was chance levels. Edge representations can be learned by a generic fitting system. And edge representations can be learned in a newborn-like world. In this case, from the kinds of experiences available in utero. Okay, so now let's scaffold down the difficulty to shape-based vision. So shape-based vision refers to visual systems categorizing objects by shape rather than other features like color. And human adults largely perceive the world in terms of shapes, and there's quite a bit of evidence for shape biases in early language learning in human development. But why do visual systems develop this shape bias? Right? Does it come from hard-coded shape primitives? Or could it be learned through generic fitting? To test this question, we created a stimuli set with 16 objects consisting of 4 colors and 4 shapes. We then asked whether a transformer model categorizes those objects by shape or by color. So let's first, again, look at the untrained model performance. And when we look at untrained model performance, we see that untrained transformers are not shape-based. They're strongly color-based. So to walk you through this diagram, I took those 16 objects and I aligned them along the top and I aligned them along the side. And essentially darker colors mean that the images are closer together in the embedding space. And lighting colors mean that images are farther away in the embedding space. So we can see that objects of the same color are quite close to one another, whereas objects of the same shape are quite distant from one another. And if we average across all of the color matches, and we average across all of the shape matches, we get the color and shape scores that I'm showing you on the right. So untrained models respond to local color values that are directly available in the input, right? They're not building these abstract representations of shape that characterize human and animal vision. We then train the transformers on video streams from head-mounted cameras that graduate students at UT Austin wore around campus. This is from the UT Egocentric or UT Ego dataset. And this essentially captures the visual data that enters the brain. So we can ask, can a generic fitting model develop shape-based vision when trained through the eyes of a human adult? And we observed a remarkable transformation in these fitting models. So when trained through the eyes of human adults, transformers transform from a color-based to a shape-based visual system. Right? Notice how the images of the same shape now cluster together in the embedding space. Right? So generic fitting combined with the visual experiences of human adults produces shape-based vision. I want to show you the untrained and trained models side by side to highlight how much this fitting model changes. So, and in the middle, I'm also showing you a t-SNE visualization to show you how the objects are organized. So again, we can see that in the untrained model, the color-based model, different shapes of a single color cluster together, right? The embedding space cares about color, not shape. Whereas in the trained system, we see different colors of a single shape clustering together. Again, a radical transformation from a color-based to a shape-based visual system. However, I haven't yet shown you whether shape-based vision is learnable from the experiences of a newborn animal. The head-mounted camera data contain thousands of objects across dozens of different scenes. But newborn animals learn shape-based vision in highly impoverished environments, including those containing a single object. It seems like a challenging test for a generic fitter. Is experience with a single object sufficient to develop shape-based vision? So to test this question, we simulated the visual experiences of newborn chicks using the digital twin environments that I showed you previously. And we then trained transformers on those simulated experiences. We also trained transformers on simulated retinal waves to explore whether shape-based vision is learnable from the experiences available to a developing fetus. Retinal waves are interesting because they don't maintain a rigid bounded shape, but they do persist and move in object-like ways. In both cases, we observed a radical shift from color-based to shape-based visual systems. So here is the transformation that we see if we train models through the eyes of a newborn chick. And here is the transformation when we train models through the eyes of a developing fetus. Again, we get this transformation from being largely color-based to being largely shape-based. So shape-based vision can start from scratch. Again, we saw that the transformers were color-based rather than shape-based. Shape-based vision can be learned by a generic fitting model like a transformer. And critically, shape-based vision can be learned in the kind of environment faced by newborn animals, including animals raised in impoverished environments containing a single object. Okay, so now let's scaffold down the difficulty even more to invariant object recognition. So this is the study that I showed you at the very beginning of the talk. The newborn chicks can be raised in a world with one object shown from one viewpoint, and then they can recognize that object across a host of other viewpoints. So to test whether a generic fitting model can do this, again, we selected our vision transformer model. And we then trained the model on, again, simulated visual experiences from the controlled varying chamber. So here are some of the images, but videos are always better. So here is an example of the simulation process that we used. So essentially what this agent does is it picks a random location in the chamber. It then moves to that location, and then it moves its head around the 3 degrees of axes. So essentially, you can think about this as canvassing the space of available visual experiences available in a controlled varying chamber. And we're taking embodiment seriously, right? Animals can move their bodies in many ways. They can move around the chamber. They can move their heads around. And so this gives us a way of asking if a transformer is trained with the same kinds of embodied experiences as a newborn animal, do they develop the same kinds of view invariant representations? And we sampled at 10 frames per second. And again, the images on the left are the images that we use to train the transformer or the fitting model. And we tested 4 different sizes of vision transformers. So including transformers with 1, 3, 6, and 9 attention heads and blocks. And all of the models developed view invariant recognition. We can see large learning gains between the untrained models and the trained models. And all of the trained models ended up reaching or exceeding chick level performance. So this suggests that generic fitting models with no hard-coded primitives of object shape or invariant object recognition can nevertheless develop the same kinds of object perception as newborn chicks when raised in the same sparse environments as newborn chicks. We also explored whether chicks and models develop the same kinds of object representations. And we did this by looking at the pattern of successes and failures across the 12 test viewpoints. So if chicks and models developed similar representations, then the pattern of successes and failures should be correlated, right? They should make the same mistakes and they should have the same successes. But if they develop different kinds of object representations, despite having the same mean level performance, we shouldn't see a correlation across those 12 test viewpoints. So to walk you through this graph, the x-axis shows the individual chicks. Those are the red dots. And then I'm showing you a few CNN models that use contrastive learning through time, and the transformer architectures that I showed you earlier that also learn through contrastive learning through time. And then on the y-axis, I'm showing you the correlation with chick performance across those 12 test viewpoints. And we can see that both CNNs and transformers learn common patterns as chicks. They learn common object representations as chicks. Right? The chicks and models succeed where the other succeeds, and they fail where the other fails. So the chicks and models appear to be learning common object representations when they're reared in the same environment. So invariant object representation can, in a sense, start from scratch in a generic fitting model. It can be learned by a generic fitting model. And critically, it can be learned in the kind of environment faced by newborn animals in controlled rearing experiments. Okay, so far, all of the models I've shown you have been disembodied passive consumers of data, right? The models were trained on embodied data streams, but they didn't perform actions and choose their own data during development. So we've also explored whether embodying fitting models learn like newborn animals. And in particular, we use pixels to actions models instantiated as reinforcement learning agents. The agents had a policy network that mapped raw pixel inputs to action outputs, and the policy network learned from an intrinsic motivation system, which provided the reward. And we've tried a bunch of different intrinsic motivation systems. For all the experiments I'll show you moving forward, they all tend to yield the same results. But you feel free to ask me questions in the question section about how they all worked. So we then asked whether fitting to this reward landscape would produce some classic animal behaviors we see in nature. So for example, would a pixels to action agent learning purely from some intrinsic motivation learn imprinting behavior? Right, so I love this picture. This is Konrad Lorenz when he imprinted a bunch of ducklings to his boots. And so as Konrad Lorenz walks down the stream, all the ducklings follow after him. Right, so can we reproduce imprinting with this kind of approach? We also asked if we could reproduce collective behavior with this approach. Right, can we produce the beautiful and dynamic displays of animals in nature simply by a generic fitter learning through something like intrinsic motivation? And we asked whether even things like us versus them, right, social preferences, might also fall out of this kind of embodied fitting machine approach. Okay, so let's start with imprinting. Imprinting is, again, a canonical innate ability. Most animal behavior textbooks regard imprinting as being innate. So it's widely regarded to require an innate imprinting system or a module, depending on who you talk to. So to test this assumption, we again took this self-supervised RL agent that has no built-in knowledge of imprinting in any way. And we first tested whether this embodied fitting machine could develop imprinting in the digital twin environments or the same kinds of environments faced by newborn chicks. So we took the embodied agent, we stuck it into our digital twin environment of the controlled rearing chamber, and we just let it learn, and this is what pops out, is essentially imprinting behavior. So this agent does the same thing that real chicks do. They spontaneously reduce the distance between themselves and the object, and they follow that object around the chamber. So this provided evidence that embodied fitting machines can learn in the same kinds of worlds as newborn animals. And so we've also kind of pushed this in a number of different ways. So here was one experiment we did where you see a whole bunch of individual virtual chicks in the middle of the screen. We inserted a separate brain into each one of those individual chicks. And then we controlled the mother hen ourselves using a controller. And the major test was, do those artificial chicks follow around virtual mom, so to speak? So here is the behavior that results. And again, I want to remind you that these chicks, that we're not controlling the little baby chicks in any way. This is spontaneous behavior that results when these animals are reared in a world with other social agents. And as we move around the mother hen, we can see that the little virtual chicks are doing what real chicks do. They're reducing the distance between themselves and the mother hen, and they're behaving a lot like how real chicks behave in nature. Again, with the same kind of sort of imprinting behavior that we end up seeing in nature. So this study suggests that imprinting, again, this classic innate behavior, can be explained, can start from scratch. Again, to remind you, our model had no built-in knowledge of imprinting whatsoever. It can be learned by a fitting model. And again, critically, it can be learned in the kind of world faced by a newborn animal. And I keep emphasizing that final point because there's this recurring argument that transformers are more data hungry than brains are, right? Or that deep neural networks in general are more data hungry. But by comparing how data hungry a model is in the same kind of world as a newborn animal, we can test if that assumption is really true or not. And in all of these cases, we find that it's not true. We find that transformers, these so-called data hungry systems, are learning just as well as brains are in these kinds of worlds. Okay, so now let's go to collective behavior. So I've always loved collective behavior ever since I was an undergraduate student. I've always been entranced by these beautiful patterns of dynamic motion that we end up seeing across nature, right? And this includes swarming insects and shoaling fish and flocking birds and even human crowds. Now, if you ask a computational biologist why this happens, they'll point you to simple attraction rules. So, for example, one attraction rule is cohesion. So this is the rule that stay close together with your neighbors. Another attraction rule is co-alignment. So align your direction of motion with nearby neighbors. And a third attraction rule is separation. So don't crash into each other, right? Maintain a little bit of distance between yourselves and your neighbor. Now, critically, if you take these interaction rules and you hard code them into an agent, you'll find that those agents spontaneously exhibit collective behavior. So this is quite interesting, right? It tells us that these three rules are sufficient to develop these beautiful and dynamic displays that we see across nature. But critically, hard coding rules into an agent tells us nothing about the origins and development of that behavior. Right? Are these rules hard coded into brains by evolution, maybe given the importance of staying together as a group for survival? Or might they be learned from experience? So to test this question, we again first selected our self-supervised reinforcement learning agent. And we then tested its untrained performance. And to test its untrained performance, we put all the agents together in the same environment, which I'll show you shortly. And then we measured the nearest neighbor index, which is the distance between each agent and the next closest agent. And when agents move randomly, they have a nearest neighbor index of 1, which you see is that orange bar in the top left corner. And this is what we observed when we tested this empirically, is our agents essentially looked exactly like the random agents established previously in the literature. We then trained the agents in a social world. So we took 10 different artificial chicks. We inserted a different brain into each one of those chicks. And then we trained all of them together in a rich world filled with grass and trees and mountains, and critically each other. And then after training, and then we observed what happens after training. So after training, we froze their brains so that they wouldn't learn anymore in the test phase. Again, and then we just tested, what does their nearest neighbor index look like? And so this is the blue bar that I'm showing you now, again, in the top left corner. We can see that the nearest neighbor index reduces massively compared to untrained model performance. Right? In brief, the agents spontaneously minimize the distance between themselves and the other agents. And again, I always like videos. It's great to see the effect. So here is the top-down view and a first-person view of these agents. So what we see is grouping behavior, right? We see little groups of artificial chicks spontaneously forming. You can see this quite well in the top-down view. And we can see that when they move, they align their direction of motion with nearby neighbors. And every time we reset it, we can see them quickly group together, again, into these cohesive dynamic groups akin to those that we see in nature. I also want to point out the first-person view. Essentially, these artificial chicks move to keep each other in view, right? They really want to keep other social agents in view, suggesting, again, that this might be partially what drives this learning of collective behavior. Okay, now one thing you might be thinking is that maybe all trained agents show this behavior, right? After all, the other agents were the most unpredictable things in the world. But alternatively, maybe collective behavior only emerges when fitting systems learn from social experiences, right? So to distinguish between these possibilities, we performed another experiment, but we trained the artificial chicks separately. So during training, they saw all the same features of the environment. They saw the grass, they saw the trees, they saw the mountains, but they didn't see other agents. And then in test, we again froze their brains and then put all the agents together in the same environment, and we measured their nearest neighbor index. And when reared in a non-social world, the agents didn't learn collective behavior. This is the green bar in the top left corner. In fact, the nearest neighbor index was actually higher than that of random agents. And again, to show you the video of what this looks like, what we see is that the agents essentially quickly disperse from one another. Right? They spend most of their time around the edges of the fence, staring at the trees and the mountains. They could care less about one another. And when we look at the first-person view of the agents, we see that the agents don't move to keep one another in view, right? It's very different from the kinds of behavior that we saw in the agents that fit to a social world. So this suggests that it's not the case that this behavior automatically emerges in transformers trained with embodied data. The social world is a critical part of what leads these models to develop collective behavior in the first place. In another study, we also wondered whether this approach would reproduce collective behavior in newborn fish. So there's a beautiful controlled rearing study published 7 years ago that showed that collective behavior develops gradually over about 3 weeks in zebrafish. So we built virtual fish tanks that mimicked the real fish tanks, and we then reared those artificial fish in those virtual fish tanks. And we found that artificial fish followed a common developmental trajectory or common developmental pathway as biological fish. We looked at a number of different behaviors, and the biological and artificial fish, which is the red line, showed common behaviors across most of them. Here I'm just showing you the average distance between the fish, which decreases across the learning phase in both the biological fish, again, that's the red line, and the artificial fish, which are all the other lines. And the other lines are different intrinsic motivation modules that we plugged into the system. Again, it didn't really matter which ones we used. We tried curiosity, we tried novelty search, we tried random network distillation. They all generally produce the same basic patterns where collective behavior emerges when artificial agents are trained in social worlds. And again, we can also look at the videos to get a better sense of what these artificial fish are doing. And what we see is fish-like behavior emerging in these systems, right? So on the left, you can see the fish moving around. They're aligning their direction of motion with nearby neighbors, essentially forming a line, a grouping line that dynamically adjusts and changes over time. And on the right, we can see the kind of classic shoaling behavior that we typically see when fish are staying in one place and aren't foraging for food. So again, these simple embodied fitting machines, as long as they're reared in the same kinds of worlds as a newborn animal, end up developing collective behavior. And we can also simulate this on a larger scale. So here we have over 100 different artificial agents that we put together into the same natural environment. And when we reared them together in the same world, they again all developed collective behavior, right? We can see the agents grouping and aligning their direction of motion with their nearby neighbors. So to return to our question, where do collective behavior rules come from, right? Are they innate or are they learned? These studies suggest that it's easily learnable in a social world, right? Collective behavior or an embodied fitting machine can develop collective behavior without any kind of hard-coded knowledge of cohesion, co-alignment, or separation. These rules emerge through generic fitting. So again, collective behavior can start from scratch. Again, these models don't have any kind of inherent interaction rules built into them. And in fact, when raised in a non-social world, they show nothing like collective behavior. These models can be learned by a fitting model, or collective behavior can be learned by a fitting model. And collective behavior can be learned in the same kind of world as a newborn animal. Recall that we raised the artificial fish and the biological fish in identical worlds and observed identical trajectories of development. So finally, we looked at social preferences. So, social preferences have widely been regarded as perhaps one area where we might look for innate or predetermined capacities. So to test this idea, we took another controlled rearing study with fish, where researchers raised fish with fish that had one of two pigment types. And then after several months, they found that the fish learned to prefer the familiar over the unfamiliar pigment type. So to test whether our artificial fish would show this same pattern, we again selected our self-supervised reinforcement learning agent. We then reared those artificial fish with fish of one of two pigment types. We had an orange fish group and we had a blue fish group. And then we tested whether the fish had a preference for orange fish or blue fish by using the same two alternative force choice test that was used in the original fish study. And here's what the data looks like. We found that the fish raised with the orange fish developed a strong preference for orange fish, and the fish raised with the blue fish developed a strong preference for the blue fish. We also used a self-segregation task where we put all the artificial fish in the same environment and then measured whether the fish spontaneously self-segregate by measuring the distance between all pairs of fish. And what we found is that the fish spontaneously self-segregate. So this is the distance between the in-group members and the out-group members. And we can see that the in-group distance between artificial fish of the same color, this is the light gray bar, is much lower than the out-group distance, or the distance between fish of different colors. So we both see a preference for fish of the same color, and we see that they spontaneously self-segregate the same way that fish do in nature. So again, social preferences can start from scratch. If we raise, I didn't show you this data, but if we raise artificial fish, again, in solitary, non-social environments, we find they don't develop any social preferences, again, showing that this isn't something that's somehow inherent in the fitting machine itself. We found that social preferences can be learned by a fitting model. And critically, again, we found that it can be learnable in a newborn's world. So to conclude, I'd like to focus on two major findings from this work. The first conclusion is that core mental skills require natural spatial temporal experiences. Right? Core visual skills develop in natural worlds, which are slow and smooth, but abnormal mental skills develop in unnatural worlds, like worlds that move too quickly or worlds that are non-smooth. So this suggests that core mental skills might be learned. Providing more support for that position, generic space-time fitting models learn common core mental skills as animals when given common experiences as animals, despite lacking core primitives of objects or space or number or social skills. So this suggests that core mental skills are not predetermined, right? They're products of generic fitting machinery adapting to natural prenatal and postnatal experiences. So the take-home message, perhaps, is that evolution built another faster fitting machine, right? The brain. And that faster fitting machine within an individual's lifetime can very quickly develop what we call core mental skills, like core mental skills of object perception and navigation, and motor skills, and so on. So my ultimate hope is that this approach can unify fields through general fitting principles. So core primitive theories are largely incompatible with fitting theories. So researchers who embrace this approach had to either explicitly or implicitly distance themselves from fitting accounts of development. And I think this is unfortunate because chemistry, evolution, culture, and artificial intelligence are all explicitly understood to operate by fitting. The mini-evolution view provides a way to think about development through the same lenses as these other fields. Right? Chemistry, evolution, development, culture, and artificial intelligence might all operate by blind brute force fitting. And if all of these fields operate by fitting, then we have so-called fitting all the way down, right? We have connective theoretical tissue or linking hypotheses between fields via these shared general principles. And while we still have a lot of work to do, I hope this continuity hypothesis through fitting can help developmental psychology unify with these other fields, again, through general principles. So what are our next steps? Well, in general, the mini-evolution view really makes two major predictions. So the first prediction is that newborn animals and generic fitting models should develop common core mental skills when reared in the same environments. And so far, we've largely focused on objects, but ultimately this should apply to object knowledge and spatial knowledge like navigation and numerical knowledge, and of course, the social skills that I also focused on in my talk. The second prediction is that newborn animals and generic fitting models should develop common abnormal mental skills when reared in unnatural worlds. So this is where the power of VR-based controlled rearing comes into play, right? We can raise animals and models, or runnable fitting machines, as we like to call them, in both natural and unnatural worlds. And then we can test whether the animals and the models develop common mental skills across a host of core capacities, right? Do they develop common object knowledge and number knowledge? Do they develop common navigation skills and social skills? Do they develop common motor skills? And do they start to explore the world in similar kinds of ways? So another goal is to make all of this controlled rearing data widely available to the community. So we're taking all of our newborn embodied Turing tests and we're building a public benchmarking platform spanning a wide range of tasks for building unified image computable models of the origins of knowledge. And my hope is that by studying newborn animals and fitting models in a closed loop experimental system, we can close the gap between animals and machines and build runnable models of the origins of intelligence. Right? So newborn animals can provide high precision benchmarks for testing our fitting models. And then fitting models can be runnable hypotheses where we can generate new predictions for validating those models with new experiments with animals. We keep going around and around this loop, and ideally we can close the gap between learning across animals and machines. And if you're interested in this, we're really kind of just getting going, but you can find some of our papers on these public newborn embodied Turing tests at our website at buildingamind.com. So just to thank many people, there's a lot of wonderful people that I've worked with. I want to highlight Samantha Wood, who has been my longtime collaborator for over 10 years on both the CHIC work and the modeling work, and is also the co-director of the lab. And we've also had many wonderful graduate students and undergraduate students that we've worked with that have provided many invaluable contributions to this research. And of course, I want to thank funding agencies, NSF, Facebook, and the James McDonald Foundation. So thank you for your time. I appreciate you being here. And if you have any questions about our research, please feel free to get in touch. And you can also check out our website, again, at buildingamind.com. So thank you very much. And again, I appreciate your time.